Palestine was an even more difficult problem. It was the traditional Jewish homeland, but over the centuries the Arabs had taken over. By 1900, a Zionist movement, bent on reclaiming Israel, had been formed in Europe. Then, in 1917, the British issued the so-called Balfour Declaration, which indicated support for a Jewish homeland in Palestine. After the Great War, there was a large influx of Jews to Palestine. But while they were bent on taking over the country, the British expected them to coexist in peace with the Arab population. The Arabs, though, increasingly resented the Jewish presence, especially since they purchased more and more land. When Hitler came to power in Germany in 1933 and began to persecute the Jews there, immigration to Palestine rose sharply. Arab anger boiled over into a full-scale revolt in 1936. Large British forces had to be sent to the country, and it took them 3 years to restore peace. By now, the Second World War had broken out, and the Middle East became of vital strategic importance. A number of campaigns were fought, including the long tussle in the Egyptian and Libyan desert between the British and the Axis forces. Palestinians fought on the British side, and some, like these men landing in France in early 1940, were in mixed Arab-Jewish units. Egypt, although the main British base, did not participate in the fighting. But Jewish hardliners in Palestine were still bent on creating an all-Jewish state and formed two terrorist groups. The Stern Gang, named after its leader, Avraham Stern, committed a number of atrocities, including the 1944 assassination of Lord Moyne, the British minister resident in Cairo. The other was Irgun, led by future Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin. This was less extreme and contented itself with attacks on symbols of British rule, such as police stations. At the end of the war in 1945, Lebanon and Syria were finally given their independence by France. Transjordan gained hers, with Mesopotamia having done so as Iraq in 1922, although British forces did not leave here until 1945. But large British garrisons remained in Palestine and Egypt, as well as other forces in Cyprus, Sudan, and Aden. The Palestine problem was to prove intractable. The Jewish Stern Gang and Irgun groupings were now joined by the moderate Haganah, formed pre-war to protect settlements from Arab attack. In October 1945, they launched attacks against police and communications, and the British Army had to be called in to control the situation. Zionist anger was further inflamed when the British announced that they were rescinding a pre-war proposal to create Jewish and Arab states out of Palestine and restricted Jewish immigration to 1,500 people per month. Many of the survivors of Hitler's Holocaust against the Jews had set their hearts on starting a new life in Palestine. On American advice, the British therefore agreed to let in 100,000 Jewish refugees from Europe. This increased Arab resentment and did not halt Jewish terrorism. One of the worst attacks by Jewish terrorists came in July 1946, when the King David Hotel in Jerusalem, which was being used by the British administration, was blown up. 91 lives were lost. The British, exhausted by 6 years fighting against the Axis powers, became desperate and called upon the United Nations to help solve the problem. A UN Special Committee was sent to Palestine in June 1947. It also visited neighboring Arab states and camps for homeless Jews in Europe, but the Palestinian Arabs refused to meet it. In the meantime, the violence continued. At the same time, the British were trying to prevent ships from Europe landing Jews in excess of the quota in Palestine. In July 1947, the Royal Navy intercepted the Exodus with 4,000 illegal immigrants on board. It was sent back to the south of France and then to Germany, where the passengers were forcibly removed. Britain was widely condemned, but de-restricting Jewish immigration would merely further antagonize the Arabs. That November, the UN decided that Palestine should be split into 3 states: Jewish in blue, Arab in orange, with Jerusalem given international status under UN administration. The British mandate was to end in May 1948. The UN solution pleased no one. The Jews resented not being allowed immediate independence, while the Arabs were angry at losing half Palestine. The British too resented being caught in the middle, as Arab and Jew increasingly turned on each other. Indeed, by spring 1948, the British had given up trying to control matters and had withdrawn to enclaves in Jerusalem and the ports of Haifa and Jaffa. In March 1945, Egypt, together with Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, and Yemen, had formed the Arab League. This became increasingly drawn into the conflict. The Jews declared the independent state of Israel immediately the British mandate ended in May 1948. The Arab League sent 30,000 troops into Palestine, and bitter fighting broke out. The UN quickly stepped in and managed to negotiate a month's truce, long enough for the British evacuation to be completed. Hostilities then resumed, with the Israelis mounting limited attacks on all fronts in order to keep the Arabs off balance. The UN intervened once more, but their envoy, Count Bernadotte, was murdered, probably by Jewish extremists, when he tried to negotiate a readjustment of borders.